Well, with last week's chapter on humility in human relationships, and with this week about civility in our dialogue with one another, I have to tell you that I'm looking forward to a couple of weeks out of the pulpit where I get to pretend she's not talking about me. I spent just a few moments this week wishing that Karen Armstrong's book was called 12 Steps so that those other people can be more compassionate. She points out what we already know, that in the private and public conversations and dialogue that we have with one another, it is incredibly easy to dehumanize each other. Whether it's political dialogue, whether it's religious factions, or as one member of our class on Wednesday night said, socks that have been left on the floor and dishes that have gone dirty in a sink for a few days with someone we deeply care about but live with. It's easy to start being more concerned with winning the argument than it is seeking the truth. It's easy to see people as a collection of their mistakes instead of human beings who make mistakes. It's so easy to imagine that we know all we need to know about someone because of the way that they voted or the congregation that they attend on a Sunday morning. Let's open up the confessional. When I read her chapter for this week and read what Karen Armstrong had to say about our being civil in our dialogue with each other, immediately a memory came to my mind of a place where I failed. In 2005, I participated in a large rally for GLBT marriage equality in Boston. This was just after gay marriage had become legal in Massachusetts, and as you can expect, there was the usual legal wrangling. There was a group of legislators getting together to decide whether or not the law would be repealed or upheld or put to a public vote. So with a group of friends and a few dozen Unitarian Universalists and a few hundred other people, I gathered in a large rally in support of marriage equality right in front of the Massachusetts State House, which is literally next door to the Unitarian Universalist Association headquarters at 25 Beacon Street in Boston. We gathered with our homemade signs and our bright, colorful t-shirts and flags, waving banners, chanting the expected chants, and singing hymns about freedom and equality. And on the other side of the street, people who were gathering to rally against our position were organized. We were literally divided by the road, and the divide was obvious. Every so often, between our moments of perfect civility, one member of either side would go and try and engage the other, and we were yelling at each other, and sometimes it got heated enough to where police officers had to remove a person from either side. I remember that day how easy it was for me to feel righteous. Righteous, not just right. Righteous. I had as clear information as I needed. I am on this side of the street, and I'm a good person. And you, on the other side of the street, well, when the legislators met to open a vote on what was going to happen next, they opened the doors to the State House, and everybody was allowed inside, except now we didn't have a road to separate us. There were no assigned seats, depending on your political party or how you wanted to vote on this particular issue, and so people from across this spectrum were clumped together inside a hot Massachusetts State House sitting next to each other, and I found myself sitting right next to a guy from the other side. I was as righteous as you can imagine. I remember that the guy sitting next to me did not want to talk about this with me, and I wasn't going to give him that chance. I kept repeating, but I just want to know why you believe what you believe. Yeah, sure I did. I remember how intentional I was about putting on the posture and the vocal intonations and the mannerisms of the kind, quiet seminarian who just wanted to know more. Internally, it was a much different story. Karen Armstrong talks in her chapter this week about how easy it is for us not to just want to make change or even win, but shame the person who disagrees with us. That's exactly what I wanted. I can't tell you the fullness of what made me keep pressuring this guy to talk with me, but when he said he did not want to engage in dialogue, he was actually the only honest person in that conversation. If he thought that what I was trying to do was anything less than humble civil dialogue, he was right. Karen Armstrong says that it's so easy and tempting for us to listen to people we disagree with just long enough to grab that nugget that we can use against them. And I was waiting, and he wouldn't give it to me. Looking back, I realized that I was wearing the mask of civility and using it as a weapon. I was hoping that either he would feel shame for not talking to me, or that when he did begin to talk to me, he would feel shame for what he had just said. I'm not even sure I wanted him to change his mind. I wanted to win. What sticks with me, it's a palpable sensation, is how good I felt about myself. Righteous, while I was right. And I was. In our chapter for this week, Karen Armstrong suggested, and I mentioned this last week as a possibility, that in this exercise in humility, civility, compassion, that we take one of our most strongly held convictions and then find a list of valid counter-arguments against it. I failed in doing this week. However, I can say that I intentionally engaged with a piece of writing that challenged my internal civility quite a bit. I'm sure that most of you remember there was this period in 2010 where there was this string of suicides of gay and lesbian youth and young adults that was making the news. Of course, just because it's not making the news right now doesn't mean that's still not a problem. But it was in the news cycle at the time, and we were having a public conversation about bullying and the rhetoric that we use about one another. And the media paid a lot of attention to the case of a young man named Tyler Clementi. You might remember he was a Rutgers student who ended his life by jumping off the George Washington Bridge. So after this string of horrific events, the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary issued a statement in the form of a public letter. And he called it Between the Boy and the Bridge. His name's Albert Mohler. He asked this question: in those days of crushing anguish and humiliation and confusion, was there no one who could have stood between that boy and the bridge? So to be fully transparent with you, my bias is not to give Albert Mohler's words a charitable listen. I've disagreed with him on more issues than I can count on my fingers, sometimes issues that I think have been silly and outdated about his opinions on things like yoga, and more importantly, issues where we disagree on a woman's role in religion and society, gays and lesbians, evolution, economics, and so on. But when Karen Armstrong asked me to consider someone for whom it would be hard to listen, Albert Mohler was on my list. So I sat down this week and I read his letter in its entirety as slowly as I could and with as much of a charitable ear as I was able. I have to tell you that a lot of it was incredibly difficult for me to read because I got what I expected. I heard his repeated assertion that homosexuality is a religious sin and must be honestly described as such. I heard a lot of the things I expected to hear, and every time I just wanted to put the letter down and read no further, right? But I kept reading, and I began to see some things that I did not expect to see. So he said that when progressives and liberals like me criticize his church for being homophobic, that we do so wrongly and are not listening to what they actually have to say. But then he went on to say that when progressives and liberals like me criticize his church of being homophobic, that we're also right. He wrote this: the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Much of our response to homosexuality is rooted in ignorance and fear. He asked leaders of his churches, what if Tyler Clementi had been in your church? Would he have heard biblical truth expressed in the context of humble truth-telling? Or would he have heard irresponsible slander, sarcastic jabs, and moralistic self-congratulation? Karen Armstrong asked us in our chapter this week, are you willing to listen? She also asked, are we willing to be changed? I do not intend to waver at all from my conviction that the only appropriate answer to this issue is full, unadulterated, love-driven, religious, and political equality for the LGBT community. And to be quite honest with you, when I was preparing for this week, I began to question what types of views deserve the respect of civility in dialogue. The journalist Krista Tippett voiced my own question better than I could when she asked whether or not religious views condemning homosexuality, however civilly they are expressed, will inevitably fuel hateful or fatal behavior. But I will tell you that when I engaged in the difficult spiritual work, it was hard for me. When I listened, something changed in me. Not my opinion on this issue or my conviction to work hard to stand on the side of love in this matter. But I think that for the first time with this particular individual, I got a glimpse of the human being who had opinions I strongly oppose. I think before I only saw a collection of opinions that I strongly oppose. This was a big step for me. It was hard to do. The horrific news this week about that mass shooting in a theater in Colorado reminds us that the attempt to live well together, to do no harm, is not naive. It is not a privileged act that we sit around and reflect on this. This is real life, and it matters. It also reminds me that all the work we do to try and be more compassionate people will never ensure that we do not see this violence again. It will happen again, no matter what we wish. But I have to tell you that I don't feel trite or naive or simple at all when I stand in this pulpit and say that if we will work on ourselves hard enough to add a little kindness to a world that needs it, it will be worthwhile. The poet David White said in our reading this morning, "This is not the age of information. This is the time of loaves and fishes. People are hungry. And one good word is like bread for 1,000. We are flush with data about one another. I have more points of data that I need to make my judgment about whether you're a good person or not. I have thousands of websites and hours of news media that help me decide to believe what I already believe. This is not the age of information. This is the time of loaves and fishes. We can be so poor in how we relate to one another. The challenge for us in this room, my friends, in our humble, inclusive religion, is to learn to stand up proudly for what we believe and be civil at the same time. If we were just going to do one or the other, it would not be a problem. Karen Armstrong calls this assertive compassion. In other words, try and be a good person without being a jerk while you're doing it. Right? Now, I have to say, even in examples from our lives that are less serious than the ones I've mentioned today, the kind of bitterness and superficiality that we carry about people who disagree with us is spiritually dangerous. It makes other human beings small in our assertion. Makes them less human. The Buddha said that when we carry around this type of bitterness, it's like we have just had poison and then we expect somebody else to die. Yeah? If we believe that this life is a win or lose situation, whether or not with our partner or spouse or a politician that we disagree with, then life becomes a tally of marks on either side of the equation, and life gets reduced to whether or not we have won. People begin being reduced to collections of opinions that we will either support or oppose, and this subtle dehumanization is dangerous. But Karen Armstrong gives us an out. She says that we can stop this work of civility and dialogue if we're willing to admit that we're actually not interested in learning about other human beings. We can stop the work of civility and dialogue if we honestly admit that we are not interested in learning about other people. But she says this is a questionable ethical position. I agree. I think for me, part of this is that my ego gets so wrapped up in what side of the street I'm on. I start to define my very humanity and worth based on whether or not I am right or wrong in important moral issues. The distinction here is, can I be wrong without being wrong? And when I start to believe that my humanity is defined by being right or wrong, or that other people's is, I'm always on the defensive. And if my humanity is defined by whether or not I have been right or wrong, then I am unwilling to admit fault when my words have hurt others. I become unwilling to admit that I have participated in action or speech that is racist or sexist or wrong because I don't want to be defined as racist or sexist or even just wrong. We have to find a way of measuring our humanity that is bigger than our mistakes. And we have to find a way of understanding that there is a common bond between us as human beings that my opinion cannot create or destroy. And here we are in our church. I mentioned last week that even Unitarian Universalists have weaknesses in our religious practice, our own points of, let's say, less than full awareness about ourselves. An interesting fact about us is that 90%, almost 90% of people in UU congregations came from another faith. That's a huge number. We have a 90% conversion rate in this faith. Now, that also means that 90% of the kids who we've raised to pay attention to all other religions but ours end up going somewhere else. Huh? 90% of us came from somewhere else, and it's so easy for us as Unitarian Universalists to walk around and say that every single world religion has some gem of wisdom to offer us, except that religion I left before I came here. I will be honest with you that I did not invite my mother to a Unitarian Universalist church for many years unless I was preaching in it, because she is a committed Christian, and I heard how easily uncharitable things fell off of the tongues of my fellow Unitarian Universalists about her religious beliefs from pulpits and classrooms and in fellowship halls. Can we be more than collections of opinions? If we believe that there is a subtle violence we do to one another when we dehumanize the person on the television screen or across the table from us, if we believe that how we talk to and about each other matters, if we believe that how we speak to one another must be redeemed, then you and I must play a part in its redemption. Just like last week, Karen Armstrong gave us no footnote saying we are to be exempted from this chapter. Our Universalist Christian ancestors joked that we had better start getting used to loving our enemies right now because we will be in heaven with them forever. But in our age, that's a relatively easy thing to say. The idea that we will all go to heaven requires no work on my part. I don't have to work hard to understand you. I don't have to watch the way I talk or act. I don't have to develop compassion or justice if I affirm that thing. It's a worthwhile thing to affirm, but it's not the whole. For us, modern universalism would ask, are you willing to create a heaven on earth that includes the people you disagree with? Not just are you willing to tolerate the fact that they exist. Tolerance is a weak religious virtue, and in the medical field it means I can take this much of you before I get sick. Huh? Not just can we tolerate the fact that other people exist and tolerate difference, are we willing in the conversations we have in our minds and across kitchen tables and in city hall meetings, are we willing to make those moments of heaven on earth for all of us? This is hard work, and we will be accountable for it. In fact, I think that as Unitarian Universalists, when we start talking about religious dialogue and civility, we are probably going to be held more accountable to this than most religions, because we're one of the only religions that goes around telling people how good we are at this. When people want to know whether we are living our faith, they will look at how we talk and walk and speak and act. They probably care little for what Emerson had to say. They will judge our faith by whether or not we are the people we say we are. This doesn't happen on its own. It's really hard. Much of it's not fun, and it requires that we intentionally engage with ideas and people we wish not to engage with. I'll offer you one tool before we go, and it comes from a man named Krister Stendahl. In addition to being the dean of my seminary decades ago, Krister Stendahl also served as the bishop of Stockholm in the Church of Sweden. And in 1985, there was a loud public controversy because there was going to be a Mormon temple built in Stockholm, and there was vocal public organized opposition against this. So Krister Stendahl held a press conference in which he offered up his rules for religious understanding. I've quoted them from this pulpit before, and I will quote them from this pulpit again. They're three, and they're simple, and they're really hard. They go like this. Number one, when you are trying to understand another religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion, not its enemies. Number two, don't compare your best to their worst. And number three, leave some room for holy envy. By this, he means that there has to be something about another tradition that you wish you had in yours. Now, obviously, these are not just rules for understanding churches you haven't heard a lot about. We are in an election year. When you're trying to understand another human being, ask their supporters, not their critics. Don't compare your best to their worst, and leave some room for holy envy. If we want the way that we speak to one another to be redeemed, we will have to be part of its redemption. Do we need any more evidence that how we speak to one another and about one another matters? Do we need any more evidence that in a world of easy violence and easy dehumanization of one another, kindness and civility and seeing the holy, moving, transcendent mystery in a human being in front of us is a good thing? Maybe you will carry these rules with you in the coming weeks. The poet said we're in the age of loaves and fishes, that people are hungry, and one good word is worth bread to 1,000. So what will your words be? Because I promise you, they will be heard. Try and learn something new this week. Perhaps relax and remember that you are more than your mistakes. And remember that there is something good and holy and ancient that moves in us and binds our humanity that my opinion will never create or destroy. We are good. We are loved. Let's act that way. Best of luck in the week ahead. And amen. What an amazing thing, flesh and blood and bones, knowing it's alive, loving other, moving, breathing, flesh and blood and bones. How long do we get to do this? Tell the people that you love them this week. Who knows when we will see this day again? May you meet the holy in unexpected places this week. May you give love and receive it freely. May you have the courage it will take to offer your life as a blessing to all the world. Go in peace. Amen.